Do you find yourself tiring of creating Planet Zoo habitats from scratch? With every new game, are you spending longer than you want figuring out the space, welfare, barriers, plants? I completely understand how overwhelming that can be, where you maybe give up and instead look on the workshop in the hopes that there's a player-made habitat you like the look of, only for it to show up locked, oddly shaped or huge, or complex pathing needed to make it work. I was right there with you at one point. That's why I've created the Starter Habitat series, which I recommend everyone looks into. Here's why. I'd say my biggest contribution to the Planet Zoo community is helping out beginner players with tips, tricks, and blueprints to make the game more enjoyable during those early learning days. One glaring omission I myself noticed when I first started playing was a lack of template habitats. We get in-game blueprints for decorated shops, facilities, even hard shelters, but there isn't any templates for habitats. Why is that? After the tutorial missions, we're thrown in at the deep end to figure this stuff out ourselves, which I know can be pretty frustrating when you're just starting out. That's why I created the Starter Habitat series. This is a set of habitat blueprints that are optimised to meet each animal's welfare needs, maximises guest viewing, it's always rectangle shaped for easy placement, and best of all, none of the starter habitats will ever need DLC or be locked due to theme or animal research needed when you try to place one in your game. Quick note here from Future Swans. After creating this video, I've noticed a glitch where you can currently load any blueprints into any zoo, regardless of whether you've carried out the required research or not. As of right now, I'm not sure whether this is an intended feature, or if it's an oversight that'll be rectified in a future game update. All I know is that on the PC version, blueprints containing items that haven't been researched will show up locked in the Blueprints tab until you've had the vet or mechanic unlock whatever item is causing it to be unplaceable. This is one of the key reasons why I started the Starter Habitat series, and it's why every habitat is enrichment free and made with non-themed building and scenery pieces. I can't see into the future, and as of right now, we've not seen any bug fixes, game updates, so I've no idea how frequently updates will happen for console. I don't even know as yet whether this is intentional or will indeed be fixed to align with the PC gameplay rules. As such, my safest course of action is to assume this is unintentional and carry on using my self-imposed starter habitat rules for now, until I hear otherwise that it's safe to start incorporating research-locked items as I so choose. I'd hate to start expanding my options now and a future game update changes the rules. Just bear in mind, through the rest of this video, where I'm talking about blueprints being locked, I recorded all of that and created a bunch of habitats before I even knew this was an issue. So if you're not sure what I'm on about with that, this is why. Right, that out of the way, back to the video. I've previously created starter habitats for every animal in the PC version of the game, and since the launch of the Planet Zoo console edition, I'm slowly building up this collection for the console version too. It does take time to create each habitat, and so far I've completed and uploaded 14 of them to the Frontier Workshop. The order I'm working on them is by continent. So far, all base game animals for Europe are finished, and I'm progressively working my way through all of the Asian species. Depending what's going on in real life, it might take a couple of months or longer to have one for every animal, but rest assured I'm working on it and won't give up until I have a starter habitat for all of them, at least the base game animals at any rate. Here's a preview of the habitats on the workshop now. The first habitat I created with the console version was for the greater flamingo. I adore the flamingo in Planet Zoo, and they're one of the easier animals to create a habitat for. They're a confident species, so don't need any special protections to hide their line of sight from guests. About the biggest issue with flamingos is how many of them can live in a social group. You can have up to 500 flamingos in one enclosure before they'll start complaining, but creating a habitat for 500 of them is a bit impractical given how much space that would take up, so this starter habitat can accommodate up to 40. Next is the red deer. This habitat can accommodate around 5 deer, so it's a little less than the maximum you can have in a social group of around 9. Although you probably could get the 9 in here, I reduced the recommended maximum because when they start having babies, the deer can have 1 to 2 offspring per birth, so I wouldn't want someone to put 8 in here and then when they all start having babies, then that's going to struggle. Key feature of this habitat is the custom-made hard shelter here. I've built this from wooden planks and beams from scratch. and it is very functional. The deer do go in here to sleep and drink some water. Next habitat, I realised at this point that I'd missed the Bactrian camel, so I went back and sorted that one out. This design is very similar to one I created for the PC version of the Bactrian camel. I just really like the simplicity of this design, although I have made some tweaks to the hard shelter to fit in better with the biome the camels would reside in. Next is the Timberwolves. Timberwolves need a lot of space, hence why this habitat is so large. Of course, I could have saved a little space by making a flat, plain terrain, but while I try to optimise habitats for gameplay, I also want them to look like they belong. So I do adjust terrain levels and add features like the rocks for forest and mountain animals. For the wolves, a feature of this habitat is the hard shelter cave. This is all they need to fulfill 100% of their hard shelter requirements, and it's so cute. They really do seem drawn to gathering here together as a pack. First habitat for Asian species is the Bengal Tiger. This was my first console build with a big cat, so fencing was important here since they can jump super high to escape. Which, something important I should mention here. At one point, both the tigers I have in here managed to escape, and I'm really not sure how. I suspect it was a temporary game glitch because after I found them roaming the zoo, I put them back in and sat watching them with the game speed turned up for a good long while, and the traversable area heat map never showed an escape point. That said, please let me know in the comments though if you do try this habitat out and they escape somewhere, so I know if anything needs tweaking for this one. Next up is the first ape enclosure, Bornean Orangutan. This starter habitat is another vast improvement on the design I came up for the PC starter habitat series. For that one, I put in a set of complex climbing frames leading to the hard shelter. But more often than not, the game pathing gets confused, which means my design was a little too complex. I've learned that it's better for the animals to always have a path they can navigate by traversing on the ground, or at the very least jumping from the ground, without the aid of climbing frames, because when the game screws up and messes up the pathing, the low welfare from losing space in that way will earn you a bunch of protesters. So lesson learned, I make sure animals can navigate without the aid of climbing now in the starter habitats. Next is the Chinese pangolin. The space here feels quite large for such a tiny creature, but this is apparently what they need. Another challenge for the pangolins is their shy status, hence why I've got the tall 2-meter one-way glass barrier around the front. I've found from previous experience, any lower than 2 meters, the animals have a sight line to guess and it causes stress issues. Putting up a higher fence than you'd think they need is a good way of dealing with this. In terms of size, you can fit 3 pangolins in here, which is the maximum the game recommends. It should also accommodate a couple of babies that they may have. For the pangolins, they've got a custom-built hard shelter, which took me far longer than I anticipated to pull this together. I've tried to keep this in keeping with an Asian feel, which is more difficult than you'd imagine considering I'm limited to non-themed scenery pieces to build the starter habitats with. From here, we're on to our first bear, Formosan black bear. I find the Formosans are one of the harder animals to create a decent enclosure for. Considering you can only have 2 of them in one habitat, they need an awful lot of space. That can have the habitats feeling rather empty to accommodate this. Another challenge with the black bears is that they are shy, so I have put a one-way glass barrier at the front to avoid stress from guests. There's also another cave hard shelter in this habitat. I tend to favour caves for the mountainous animals. Following the Formosan, I've built a habitat for the Garial. Aside from the flamingos, this is the first habitat that has a large water requirement. It took a few tries to get the water level right. A key issue in Planet Zoo with the larger crocodilians is ensuring you accommodate their navigation issues. The way animal navigation works, you have to make spaces big enough for them to do a 360-degree turn in all space. With something small, like say the pangolin, that's super easy. But with large crocodilians like the Garial, it's an absolute nightmare because of how long they are. That's why I've reserved the planting in this habitat for the outer edges, and everything inside the habitat is super low in height to make sure they can get over it. Currently, I can accommodate 7 Garials in this habitat, and that's the maximum for the social group that the game recommends. However, I know the Garials are pretty prolific breeders, and you may have to reduce the number of females you have in here down a bit to accommodate if they're all having lots of offspring. Next, I worked on the giant panda habitat, another large enclosure. In-game, you can have up to 10 pandas in a social group, but again, I felt that was too many for a starter habitat. So this enclosure can accommodate around 8. Again, if they start having plenty of babies, which probably isn't the case because the pandas aren't that great at breeding. But if you do have too many babies, you might need to reassess how many original pandas you have in here. The hard shelter for the pandas, this was a right pain to create. It has a custom roof, mostly made out of the corrugated metal panels, and those panels, didn't realise at first, but they have a really odd shape, so they don't really fit in with any of the other pieces. That said, I'm glad I persevered because it's a great open space right at the front, and the pandas do enjoy hanging out in here. With the trees and planting in this enclosure, the pandas love a lot of coverage, and I absolutely could have added twice as much as I've got in here, but I did refrain from going all out with this. I try to bear in mind with starter habitats not to go overboard on the piece count. So although there's a lot in here, I like to leave it up to the players whether they want to add more or leave it as is due to reducing the complexity meter size. Next up is the Himalayan brown bears. This habitat's based on the design I created for the Formosan black bears, but it's a lot smaller for the Himalayan bears as they're nowhere near as space hungry. Something to watch out for with the Himalayan brown bears is that they need snow coverage in the terrain. There is a few animals in game that demand a snowy environment. Next is my favourite habitat created for the series so far, Indian elephants. This is a huge improvement on the habitat I made for the PC series. The elephants need so much room, and they have a water requirement which also adds to that issue. For social requirements, you can have up to 30 Indian elephants in an enclosure, but that was coming out at over 5,000 meters squared in space, and I just couldn't do it. So the maximum you can keep in this one is about 12, give or take. I feel like that's plenty though for a starter habitat, and you can see how huge this is. It's about 4,000 meters squared in total. I wouldn't recommend putting 30 elephants in here. You're going to have a problem if you do that. What I loved about this enclosure, the Indian elephants are one of the few animals that are happy with a lot of short grass for the terrain. So I decided to complement the bright green grass with the yellow plaster panelling for the hard shelter, barriers and soil retaining walls. I think that with where I've put everything in this space, it works really well with the big size and doesn't quite feel as large as it actually is. Another hugely improved starter habitat I've created for the console version is the Indian peafowl. In general, the peafowls are both the easiest and the worst animals to create a habitat for. They breed like crazy, so I've accommodated for that and made the enclosure big enough to house 20 of them, which is the maximum recommended. So size-wise, the enclosure does look quite big considering I've accommodated for a lot of them, and it's made worse because the peafowls can only handle a very small amount of vegetation. Hence why I've got quite an oversized hard shelter in here for them, trying to break the space up a little bit. I've also added quite a lot of cobblestone-like rockwork to help the outside area feel less empty. In here, I've got a forage feeder enrichment item just to demonstrate what that looks like. But be rest assured, all of the habitats uploaded to the workshop are definitely enrichment free, avoiding them appearing locked if you haven't carried out the vet research for the animals yet. The last starter habitat I've created at this point for the console version of the game is the Indian rhinoceros. This one took ages because I underestimated the rhino's ability to navigate within the habitat. So what I produced at first was rather too small and had to redo the back barrier and make sure everything else fit within that. So a lot of extending and moving pieces to get this to work. The rhinos also have a water requirement, so there's a little pond in here for them to wade into. It's oversized at the moment. It's about twice as big as they need for water requirements, but I think any smaller and the pond would look a bit out of place in this habitat. Also a big hard shelter in this enclosure. I made sure there's big open windows in here to let in some light. That's everything I've built so far. Still many, many more to go. Let me know what you think of the habitats so far and the series in general. It's a lot of work my end, so I do really hope it's useful for players. You can download all of these 14 now on the Frontier Workshop. They're all tagged under habitats, so see if you can find one of mine, and then you can search for them all through my profile. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll have an update in the coming weeks when I have another block of habitats completed.